Hey everyone, how's it going? I thought that today, in honor of Tag Tuesday, I would hit you with a tag. And I thought that since we're approaching the middle of the year, I would do the Midyear Book Freakout Tag. So this is a tag that I really love watching people do, and which I also have historically really enjoyed doing. But I was surprised when I looked through my back catalog of videos to find that I actually have not done this tag for about 3 years. I think for the past couple of years, I've settled with doing a best books that I've read so far in the year kind of video. But this year I felt like I would rather do a tag because that gives you a bit more structure. And I like the questions in this tag. There are some questions that people turn their noses up at, but I do not. But anyway, I've started to see people do this tag, so I thought I would throw my hat in the ring and do it. So anyway, first question or first prompt is best book you have read so far this year. And that is definitely still Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. This is a huge novel about an immensely huge cast of characters, most of whom are either Russian, Ukrainian, or German, and many of whom are Jewish. And it's about their experiences on the Eastern Front during the Second World War. Now, when I describe it like that as kind of a historical novel, I feel like it kind of minimizes what it really is, which is really a meditation on just human existence and the human struggle to do good in the face of overwhelming evil. And it has one passage in it on that subject that is one of my favorite passages in all of literature, and which I see myself just returning to as kind of a meditative experience when I'm in need of feeling some hope for the world. And it's really powerful just as that. But it has magnificently well-drawn characters. And what it also has is a really fascinating portrait of authoritarianism in the form of the Soviet Union. And as Robert Chandler in his preface to this edition that I have says, this is, I think, one of the great portraits of what it's like to live under an authoritarian regime, in addition to just one of the greatest war novels of all time and one of the greatest novels of all time. So this is great. I wish it were as well known as other great Russian novels like War and Peace, which this is partly sort of modeled on Brothers Karamazov and so on. I would put this right up there with the Brothers Karamazov and other books. I haven't actually read War and Peace, but I would put it up there with any other great classic of Western literature. And I wish it were a bit more well-known. It certainly is revered by a lot of people, but I feel like it should be more widely known. So anyway, you have my recommendation that Life and Fate is pretty excellent. All right, number 2, the best sequel that you've read so far this year. Now, I pondered what I should give for my answer to this question a little bit, because I'm not entirely certain what constitutes a sequel. I mean, I know what a sequel is, but what I struggled with was whether a sequel had to be a book that follows another book that was formerly a standalone book, or whether it could just be any book in a series that wasn't the first book. And if the definition of a sequel were the latter, were just any book in a series that wasn't the first book, then probably my answer to this question would have been one of the Earthsea novels by Ursula K. Le Guin, which I finished reading at the beginning of this year. And certainly the 5th and 6th novels could have been contenders for this question. But I decided to interpret sequel in the strictest way, which is as a book that follows immediately after another book that was either the first book in a series or was formerly a standalone book. And so for me, the best sequel is Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler, which is her follow-up to Parable of the Sower, which is probably more well-known than Parable of the Talents, although I wouldn't say Parable of the Talents is exactly obscure. But Parable of the Sower, for those who aren't familiar, is a kind of dystopian novel, lightly dystopian novel that takes place in the near future of 2020, but the novels were published in the 1990s, so for them that was the near future. But it takes place in a near future dystopia where sort of race relations in the United States have deteriorated significantly, and people of different racial and ethnic groups are largely living in sort of segregated communities away from one another, because that's just how bad relations have become between people of different racial and ethnic groups. But squalor and poverty and economic inequality have become rampant in the United States, and corporations have become more and more of a prominent presence in everybody's lives. There are entire cities run by corporations. And then on top of all that, just environmental degradation has proceeded to such an extent that much of the United States is just uninhabitable, and much of the rest of it is ravaged by horrible weather, horrible climate, and so on. So it's a very, very plausible dystopia. And on top of all of that, there is a presidential candidate who is this strongman, right-wing wannabe dictator who's running for president. And in Parable of the Talents, we see that strongman, right-wing, religious fundamentalist wannabe dictator, who, by the way, uses "Make America Great Again" as his campaign slogan, he actually gets elected. And what Parable of the Talents is, in addition to the other aspect of the story, which is about a woman named Lauren Olamina, what it is, in large part, is an exploration of religious fundamentalism, which is something that I find really interesting. I find religious fundamentalism as a phenomenon really interesting, but I really like sort of sensitive explorations of it. And in large part, that's what Parable of the Talents is. So in Parable of the Sower, the actual story of Parable of the Sower is about a young woman named Lauren Olamina, who's a young black woman growing up in the Los Angeles area, who obviously has grown up in this time of great distress, right? But she begins to conceive of this new religion, which she kind of bases on her own sort of insights into the universe. It's not like a revelation from God. She kind of comes up with it on her own. But the religion is called Earthseed. And some of the Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents is taken up with quotes from this sort of holy text that she writes for this new religion. In Parable of the Sower, the actual story is Lauren and a ragtag group of people trying to get to Canada, to safety, what they see as safety, because they think that Canada will be safer because it has less political unrest. The climate there isn't as bad because it's further north. And they don't make it to Canada, but they settle down in the northwestern United States, I believe in Washington or Oregon. And then in Parable of the Talents, we see them trying to build a community. You know, they've settled down, and now they're trying to build a community in this, again, world of tumult. And that's basically the story. But really what I found fascinating about Parable of the Talents was as an exploration of religious fundamentalism. So, anyway, really, really good book. A little bit difficult for me to summarize it all in one go like this, because obviously summarizing sci-fi fantasy stuff is a lot, but really, really good. I recommend it, so there's that. All right, number 3 is a question that I don't really have an answer to. This is the new release that you haven't read from this year but want to. I don't keep up very well with new releases, so I don't really have an answer. I'm sorry. But I do actually have an answer for number 4. And number 4 is the most anticipated release for the second half of 2022. And this, of course, for me, is hands down the 2 new novels that we are going to be getting from Cormac McCarthy, who is one of my favorite writers. Again, I don't keep up very well with living writers, but certainly one of my favorite living writers. And he has not one, but 2 new novels coming out later this year. One will be called The Passenger, and the other will be called Stella Maris. And I was so excited to hear that we're getting our first books from Cormac McCarthy since The Road was published in, I think, 2004? Almost 20 years ago. So I'm just pumped to be getting more books from McCarthy. I am pretty fascinated by the fact that one of these 2 novels is actually going to be from the perspective of a female protagonist. And the reason that's interesting is because, much as I love Cormac McCarthy, I am definitely of the camp that believes that he could not write a decent female character if his life depended on it. So it will be really interesting to see how he pulls off a novel that is entirely from the perspective of a female character. But anyway, I'm just pumped to be getting more McCarthy later this year. So that, hands down, is my answer for that one. Number 5, biggest disappointment this year. Now, I can thankfully say that I have not had very many disappointments this year. I have actually had a really great reading year. In fact, I've been finding a lot of new favorites, been reading a lot of great stuff, and I'm really happy with how my reading year is going. So there's not much for me to pick from in terms of disappointments. And even the book that I've picked is not really itself a disappointment. But the book that I ended up picking for this is this. So this is Muhammad, A Biography of the Prophet by Karen Armstrong. And this is a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, who founded Islam. And it's a soup-to-nuts narrative of his life and his times. It's also kind of a commentary on Islamic history. Karen Armstrong wrote this book in part as kind of a antidote to a lot of the Islamophobic rhetoric she saw going around at the time. This book was published in 1991, and if Islamophobic ideas were a big problem then the problem has only gotten worse. And so in part, this was written as a response to Islamophobic ideas that were prevalent at the time and that are still, unfortunately, prevalent in the West. So in addition to being a history of Muhammad's life and times and a commentary on Islamophobic propaganda, it's also kind of a commentary on the Quran as a religious text, which is pretty cool. I have read the Quran once, but this book really made me want to reread it. And so I would recommend this book as informative on the life of Muhammad, on the times of Muhammad, on what the Quran says and how to read the Quran, and as a nice antidote to a lot of, again, the Islamophobic ideas that have become prominent in the West. However, one thing that I realized while reading this book that was really unfortunate is that I just don't think that Karen Armstrong is a very good writer. She's very smart, she's very learned, she's very thorough, but her writing is very academic. It's very choppy prose. It almost at times reads a little bit like an academic article, which is not the kind of prose style that you want to be going for in a popular book like this. And she's just not a very gripping storyteller. Muhammad's life is filled with fascinating and thrilling anecdotes, and she doesn't do a great job of conveying them. I mean, you get the sense of what happened, but it's just not very thrilling to read about, and I feel like it should be. And that was unfortunate because in the past couple of books I've read by Armstrong, I've been starting to realize the fact that she's just not a great prose stylist, that she's just not a great writer, learned as she is, and much as I like what she says, and much as I agree with her on many things, she's just not a great writer. And that was really disappointing to realize while reading this book, because Karen Armstrong for a long time was one of my favorite writers. A few years ago, when there was a tag going around about your favorite writers, I did that tag, and I listed Karen Armstrong as one of my favorite writers. And I don't think I would anymore, because I don't think she's a great writer. She's a great scholar, perhaps, but they're two different things, unfortunately. So that was disappointing. It is not fun to feel like you're falling out of love with an author. So that was disappointing. Even though the book itself was, again, informative, interesting, I learned a lot, and so on. It was disappointing to realize that while I read it. Okay, number 6 is biggest surprise this year. And so I have a bit of an odd answer for this one. And my answer is actually a reread. And it's this. It's Murphy by Samuel Beckett. So I read this a few years ago and didn't find it to be very memorable. I didn't dislike it, but I didn't love it. I just thought it was a little bland. Bland characters, bland story, bland writing, but I reread it this year as a part of my big project to read all of the major works of Samuel Beckett. And for those who aren't aware, Murphy is Samuel Beckett's first novel that he ever wrote. He had written and published a collection of short stories before Murphy, and I believe he wrote a novel before this that didn't get published until much later, maybe even after his death. But this was his first published novel. And it's not really a novel of his that many people know about or read. It's not regarded exactly as one of his masterpieces, although Harold Bloom thought that it was his best work. So there's that. But most people don't read Murphy, I don't think. When they think of Beckett, they think of his great plays like Endgame and especially Waiting for Godot, and they think of the trilogy of novels, right? Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable. But they don't really think of Murphy very much. And I reread it, obviously, and like I said, the first time I read it, I didn't find it very inspiring. And so going into it, I was a little bit apprehensive. I was like, I don't know, this might not end up being a fun thing to reread just because I didn't care for it that much the first time. But I just loved it the second time. You could still maybe say that the characters are a little bland. You could still maybe say that the story is a little bland, but the writing is just superb. There are so many eloquent passages in the book, but more importantly, they are eloquent and funny. This is a very funny novel, just in the way that so many things are described and so much of Samuel Beckett's turns of phrases. It's such a funny book, and I underlined so much in this. It really is just a really well-written book and really funny. It has its philosophical ideas, and it has at least one character, Murphy, the title character, who is quite fascinating. But the writing is just the star of this novel. It's so good. There's one passage that I love in particular that describes a man sitting down and just the pleasure that he gets from sitting down, from the act of placing his butt cheeks into a seat. And he loves the feeling of that so much that he gets back up and sits back down again. And I just think it's a delightful book to read in terms of the writing. So that was a surprise to reread that and just love it so much more the second time. So that is that. Number 7 is new favorite author, and that is hands down William Blake, the great English poet of the second half of the 19th century, or second half of the 18th century and first half of the 19th century. I've just been loving the rhetorical power of his poetry. I think The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, one of his moderately long poems, is one of my new favorite poems of all time. But what I've been starting to get into is Blake's sort of mythological system. He had this whole mythological system worked out for how the universe was created and how we got to where we are as humans and so on. And it was kind of a quasi-biblical story of the fall of man and this sort of thing. It's hard to describe in one video like this, but I've started to really get into that whole mythos of Blake. And that's just been fascinating in terms of the kind of philosophical ideas that he explores. He explores a lot of kind of ideas that we would see as heretical, or that would have been seen as heretical at the time. He was fiercely critical of organized religion. And going back to the themes about religious fundamentalism that come up in Parable of the Talents, I think Blake is really relevant because of his commentary on religion, on institutionalized religion, which could also be applied to religious fundamentalists. So I think he's really relevant in that sense. But he's also relevant because he was very progressive, actually, in many ways. He was fiercely anti-slavery, very pro-women's rights, and so on and so forth. But really, I've just been intrigued by the whole full mythological and philosophical system that he kind of developed. So I've just been loving this. I'm about a third of the way through his complete poems here. And hoping I can get through the whole thing by the end of the year. We will see, but definitely he's an author who I will return to and cherish. All right, number 8, newest fictional crush. This is a question that a lot of people love to turn their noses up at, but I'm not going to. I'm gonna give my fictional crush. And my fictional crush this year is Anne Elliot, the protagonist of Jane Austen's Persuasion. And I think I felt like Anne Elliot was something of a kindred spirit with me. I feel like she and I would have a lot in common in terms of our personalities. But I think that what helps is that she's the same age as me, or she was the same age as me when I read the novel. When I read the novel, it was earlier this year when I was still 27. I have subsequently turned 28 and am now a year older than her. But I think I resonated so much with her character because she is at that stage of being in the late 20s and not really being a kid anymore, but not quite being middle-aged, and kind of dealing with what the struggles of that time in life. And so I just felt like she was kind of a kindred spirit. And I also feel like she and I have kind of similar personalities. So I think she's kind of my new fictional crush. Number 9, newest favorite character. And that, hands down for me, is Egil from Egil Saga, which I read this year as a part of Sagalong, with a bunch of people. And Egil is the, obviously, title character of this old Icelandic saga. And he is this anti-hero, right? He's really, when you first meet him, he's kind of a vile person. He's kind of a mini psychopath, because you meet him when he's first a kid. And he never exactly becomes likable, but you do see him kind of gain wisdom over his life and start to smarten up and become wiser and more measured and more thoughtful and perhaps more sympathetic. And what's great about Egil's saga is that it really is kind of a birth to death story of Egil's life. And by the time he's an old man, he's grown to such a point that he actually becomes kind of an arbiter of justice. Actually, so this man who started out as this killer, this psychopath, and it's not to say that he becomes a hero or something, but you see him go from that to being much wiser and able to actually distribute justice. And that was so fascinating, and I feel like so very modern. You know, he reminded me of a lot of kind of modern anti-heroes, especially from like television shows, like Tony Soprano from The Sopranos, or Walter White from Breaking Bad, people like that. And he was just an utterly fascinating character, and Egil Saga is a great read. It's a good place to start with the Icelandic sagas, I feel like, because it also has kind of an origin story for the sagas. But if you don't read it for that, read it for Egil, because he's such a fascinating character. So there's that. 10, a book that made you cry this year. Now, I can't actually remember the last time I cried while reading a book, so I really didn't cry while reading this book. But a book that did profoundly move me was The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. There's one passage in particular that really got to me in this book. This passage where a mother is kind of preparing her young son to leave her, basically. Her young son is being taken away from her, and she's just preparing him to leave. He's going to live with his biological father, his mother's ex-husband, and she's just preparing him. And that passage really got to me. But this is a really moving novel, a really just brilliantly written book. It's one of those books where the story is magnificent, the writing is magnificent, the atmosphere is magnificent, the way it captures childhood is magnificent, but the writing, again, like in Murphy, the writing is just the star of the book for me. But that passage was extremely moving. So there's that. Number 11, a book that you read this year that made you happy. And for that, I'm going to go with The Golden Ass by Apuleius. So this is an ancient Roman novel, of which we only have a few, and I believe this is the only ancient Roman novel that we have in its entirety. But this is an ancient Roman novel in which a man, who incidentally is named Apuleius, accidentally gets transformed into a donkey, and then just sort of roams around the countryside, meeting various misfits and occasionally crazy people, and it's just bonkers. This book is just bonkers. The stuff that happens in it is insane. And I just got so swept up in how crazy it was and the funny little anecdotes that you get in it. And it's a fun book. I don't know how profound it necessarily is, but it's kind of this romp through human depravity, but human depravity seen through this comic lens, because you're seeing it through the eyes of a donkey who has the intelligence of a human being. And just the insanity of it made me happy. It's just such a weird book, but I really enjoyed it. Question 12 is the most beautiful book you've bought so far this year. I'm happy to say that I have not actually bought that many books this year. I announced at the beginning of this year that I was only going to be reading fiction this year, with exceptions, as you've seen. But because I've been reading only fiction, I haven't been buying as many books because I tend to purchase a lot more nonfiction than fiction. But because I'm not reading any nonfiction, I don't obviously feel like I should be buying nonfiction. So that's been a great way of reducing my book buying habits. But one book that I did acquire this year that is really beautiful is this modern library edition of Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, which I have read once. I read this once in college as a part of a class on Thomas Hardy. And I love Tess of the D'Urbervilles. For a long time, it would have been my favorite Thomas Hardy. I think now I would put Jude the Obscure as my favorite Thomas Hardy, but I need to reread Tess. And there's a lot of Hardy that I have not read. So anyway, but it's beautiful, right? Like I love these copper spines. I love the artwork on the front of this one. What I love about these editions too is that they're just very floppy. You know, they're very easy to handle, right? The covers are nice and floppy, but the spine stays intact quite nicely. And I feel like the font and margins in the actual book, in these modern library editions, I feel like it really strikes a happy median between fitting a reasonable amount of text on each page, but also leaving enough white space to leave a reader like me, who's a slow reader, in feeling at ease. So yeah, I was really glad to find this, and I replaced my old copy with this. My old copy was a really beaten Penguin Classic, and obviously Penguin Classics are awesome too, but it was just really beat up, and it was secondhand and everything. So it's great to have a nice new copy of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And then finally, the last prompt is, what do you need to read by the end of the year? And I just have a set of buddy reads set up for the rest of the year, and so those are really the only books that I'm putting pressure on myself to read and get done. And so that includes reading all of the plays of Aristophanes, which I'm buddy reading with Elena Macredina. Elena Macredina and I are also going to buddy read the Hellenica by Xenophon, another ancient classic, a history of the Peloponnesian War between the Athenians and the Spartans. I'm going to be buddy reading The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane with Sharon Goforth. Really excited to read that. I'm also going to be buddy reading with Sharon Goforth a biography of Abraham Lincoln by Carl Sandburg, which we're going to be taking really slowly, she and I'm pumped about that. I'm going to be buddy reading The Secret History by Donna Tartt with Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading. And I think those are all the buddy reads I have planned so far. So really, those are all. In terms of books I have to read, that's all. So not too much. Other than that, I get to read whatever I please. So anyway, if you want to do this tag, please do. I'm not going to tag anyone, but please do the tag if you want to. But anyway, I will leave it at that and talk to you all soon. Bye.